Hey guys, tonight we slip into a world of wet clay and starlight where you can almost feel cool river air brushing your face as a scribe smooths a tablet under a lantern that barely pushes back the dark. You're not running from anything, you're just walking slowly through an old city that still smells like mud brick after rain, listening for the way a story can echo across millennia. Some parts are widely accepted history, some parts are interpretation, and some are calm. What if imagination? We will keep the solid ground separate from the mist, and if the evidence is thin, we will say so. You will hear cautious words like might, may, could, and historians debate because bedtime is not the time for yelling, certainty at your nervous system, and honestly you probably will not survive this place in the practical sense because you would last about 8 minutes before you complain about sand in your sandals and get assigned to carry reeds forever. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also tell me your location and your local time in the comments, because I love the idea of this turning into a tiny global campfire. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You step forward and the city takes you in without asking your name. The street is a hard packed ribbon of earth, and the walls on either side rise like quiet cliffs of sun-baked brick. Somewhere nearby, water moves through a canal with a slow, patient sound, the kind that makes your eyelids feel heavier just by existing. Most historians agree that the earliest writing we can read from Mesopotamia begins as something very ordinary. It is lists. It is counting. It is the ancient version of someone checking inventory and muttering, "Yep, we are out of barley again." You pass a courtyard where a man kneels beside a shallow basin. He is not praying. He is doing what looks like office work, but with more mud. A lump of clay sits in his palm, and with a reed stylus he presses tiny wedge marks into the surface. Each press is clean, confident, and slightly hypnotic. Archaeology suggests that many tablets were made for administration, accounting, and legal matters, and the evidence we do have points to temples and palaces collecting and organizing them. In other words, paperwork is older than your favorite streaming service, and it is somehow more durable. You linger because you can feel that the tablet is not just a thing. It is a moment captured. It is a voice that does not need lungs. And here is where the bedtime mystery begins gently without trying to sell you a miracle. One interpretation is that even the most practical writing carries a second layer, not because it is magical, but because humans are human. When you write, you choose what to include. You choose what to leave out. You choose which words get repeated until they become habit. So it is possible that patterns in these clay records, the way certain ideas keep showing up, might be doing more than bookkeeping. Let me rephrase that more carefully, because bedtime deserves honesty. That is a possibility, not a certainty. What is broadly accepted is that Sumerian texts include hymns, myths, prayers, and royal inscriptions alongside lists and receipts. So there is a real mix of the mundane and the poetic. The question, the soft one you can hold without squeezing it too hard, is whether some of the poetic language might have been used as a kind of warning or at least a reminder to future listeners. You walk toward a building that rises above the neighbourhood, a stepped shape that catches moonlight on its edges. In the day, it will look like a mountain made of brick. At night, it feels like a quiet ladder. Most historians agree that large temples played central roles in Mesopotamian cities, acting as religious and economic hubs. The air smells like baked clay smoke, and something faintly sweet like dates left in the sun. A sleepy joke drifts through your mind. You are basically touring the world's first bureaucracy, and somehow it still has better architecture than the average strip mall. Inside a dim room, you find shelves. Not paper, not books, but stacks of tablets, each one a small rectangle of dried earth. Some are thick, some thin, some cracked. You run your fingers along a groove where a stylus once pressed, and you feel the texture like tiny footprints. Archaeology suggests that tablets were often stored in groups, sometimes with labels, and that scribes trained for years to master the script. You imagine the training like a very strict art class, except if you mess up, the teacher does not say, "Try again." The teacher says, "Congratulations, you just ruined a week's worth of clay, and everyone will remember." A tablet sits open on a low stand, and you lean close, as if you could read it without being taught. You cannot, but you can feel the rhythm in the marks. Lines, repeated shapes, a structure. And that is the first clue in tonight's What If, because structure is where meaning hides. The Anunnaki enter the scene here, but we are going to be careful. The evidence we do have points to the Anunnaki as a group of deities in Mesopotamian tradition, appearing in different texts and later traditions with shifting roles. They are not a single character with a clean biography. They are more like a committee of cosmic names, the kind of committee that would absolutely schedule a meeting at dawn and then act surprised when nobody is cheerful. Most historians agree that gods in this world are woven into explanations of kingship, justice, fertility storms, and the rightness of the city itself. So when you see divine language, you are often seeing how people made sense of power and uncertainty. Now the misty part. The gentle imagination. A careful reading might suggest that some divine stories carry a second function, like a moral code or a memory device. Humans have always used story to teach what cannot be easily taught. Do not touch the fire becomes a myth about punishment. Do not break the social order becomes a story about gods withdrawing favour. It is possible that when Sumerian scribes wrote about powerful beings who come and go, they were expressing a truth about cycles. Rulers rise and fall. Floods come and retreat. Trade brings strangers. Disease appears and disappears. The return is a pattern the mind recognizes. Historians still argue whether certain mythic motifs should be read primarily as theology, as political messaging, as social psychology, or as poetic reflections of natural forces. And that debate matters because it keeps you from grabbing one interpretation and calling it the hidden truth. We are not proving anything tonight, we are following clues. And the clue right now is simple. People wrote, people repeated, people preserved. You drift deeper into the scribal room, and the sound of the city becomes muffled, like you have stepped into a blanket made of brick. A lamp flickers. You hear the scratch of reed on clay. A scribe speaks softly to an apprentice, and the apprentice nods like someone pretending they are not confused. A second sleepy joke arrives if you think modern taxes are stressful. Imagine paying yours in grain while someone judges the handwriting on your receipt. You notice something that feels almost modern. Some tablets are signed, not always with the personal name like a signature, but with marks indicating who wrote it or where it belongs. The evidence we do have points to scribal identity and training being important, and it is broadly accepted that writing was power. If you can record a contract, you can enforce it. If you can list a debt, you can collect it. If you can write a hymn, you can shape the way people imagine the gods. So what if the same tool used to count barley was also used to send a long, slow message into the future? Not a secret prophecy with a date circled in red, because that is not how these texts work. But maybe a pattern, maybe a warning shaped like a story, maybe a reminder powerful forces, whether they are kings, droughts, empires, or the gods themselves, do not stay gone forever. This theory is not widely accepted, but it can be held as a bedtime thought. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, then the Sumerian habit of writing becomes more than history. It becomes a bridge. The mystery is not in what we know, but in what we can't confirm, especially when so many tablets are broken or missing. Archaeology suggests thousands upon thousands of tablets survive, yet they represent only a fraction of what once existed. Imagine the rest, lost to water, crumbled, reused as building material, melted back into mud like the city reclaiming its own paper. You step out into the night air again, carrying the feel of clay dust on your fingertips. The stars above are sharp and cold, and you remember that these people watched them too. Not with telescopes, not with spacecraft, but with eyes that had nothing else to distract them. One interpretation is that careful sky watching shaped both practical calendars and symbolic language. Seasons matter, flood timing matters, when to plant matters, and in a world where survival depends on timing, the sky becomes a clock, and clocks can feel like warnings when they strike. You walk past a canal, and the water reflects a thin slice of moon. Your footsteps slow. The city seems to exhale. You can almost hear the quiet confidence of the scribes behind you pressing marks that might outlast their bones. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. Tonight you let all three sit together without fighting, and in that calm you allow one cinematic what if to settle over you like a warm cloth. What if a scribe, after counting grain and recording debts, pauses and adds a line that does not belong to numbers? Not a shout, not a panic. Just a phrase about beings who return, about a tension that comes back around, about the way the world repeats its lessons until you finally learn them. You do not need to believe it. You only need to feel the possibility as you move through the sleeping city and as the soft fan hum in your room starts to rhyme with the distant canal water in your imagination. You keep walking, and the city's night air grows cooler near the water. The canal runs alongside you like a slow dark ribbon carrying the faint scent of river mud and green reeds. It is not romantic in a postcard way. It is practical. It is the kind of water that keeps a place alive, the kind that decides whether bread exists next month. Most historians agree that southern Mesopotamia depends on rivers and irrigation, especially in a landscape where rain alone is not enough. Archaeology suggests that people dig canals, raise embankments, and guide water into fields, turning flat land into something that can feed a city. You can almost hear the logic of it even at night. Water is work. Water is planning. Water is the reason someone wakes up early and someone else complains that the canal is clogged again. You pass a small gate where a man stands with a lamp and a bored posture. He looks like security, except his paycheck is probably measured in grain and his benefits package is a firm handshake. You nod as you walk by and he does not stop you because you look like someone heading toward a task. In this city, purpose is the closest thing to a passport. The closer you get to the centre, the more the buildings feel organised around a shared heart. Most historians agree that temples and their households play major roles in many early Mesopotamian cities, not only in religion, but in storage and redistribution. The evidence we do have points to temple complexes receiving goods, recording rations, and coordinating labour. In a modern aside, you realise the first big institutions are basically a mix of city hall, warehouse, and spiritual customer service desk, with longer lines and fewer chairs. You come to a wider canal, and the water reflects the sky like a dark mirror. On the far bank, you see rows of date palms and low fields. The land looks calm, but you can sense the invisible math behind it. Someone decides how much water moves where. Someone checks the gates. Someone argues quietly but intensely about whose field got shorted. You can imagine the complaints. My barley is thirsty. Your barley is dramatic. Everyone's barley thinks it is the main character. Archaeology suggests that early cities grow into complex systems where labour, food and authority intertwine. The evidence we do have points to households, workshops and scribal offices coordinating production. Most historians agree that writing supports this complexity by keeping track of obligations and distributions. You can picture a worker receiving a ration and a scribe pressing a stylus into clay, and the worker watching the marks with the same suspicion you might give a modern contract. It is the ancient version of reading the fine print, except the fine print is literally pressed into mud. Now the softer interpretive layer enters not as a secret, but as a human habit. One interpretation is that sacred storytelling helps organize social order in a world that needs cooperation to survive. When water must be shared, when canals must be cleaned, when fields must be planted on time, you need more than muscle. You need meaning. Stories can teach patience. Stories can justify hierarchy. Stories can make rules feel like part of the universe instead of just someone's opinion. You move along a path that runs beside the canal and you hear faint voices from a courtyard where people sit close together. A pot simmers. Someone laughs, tired but real. You cannot see their faces clearly, yet you can sense their rhythm. They trade gossip, they trade advice, They trade little lines of myth the way people trade memes now. And that is where you feel how myth might function, not as an escape from reality, but as a tool for reality. A careful reading might suggest that when a culture tells stories about gods who assign roles, distribute powers and punish chaos, those stories also teach people how to fit into the machine without tearing it apart. Historians still argue whether these myths are primarily religious devotion, political messaging, moral instruction, or poetic reflections of nature and society. To be clear, this is debated. But even in debate, you can see the practical edge. If you tell the story a certain way, you make the canal feel sacred. If the canal feels sacred, maybe fewer people sabotage it in a bad mood. Or maybe they still sabotage it, but they do it with guilt, which is at least a step toward a better behaviour. A small shrine sits near the water, a simple space, with offerings that look like food and flowers. You slow down because the shrine makes the canal feel watched, not in a scary way, more like in a community way, like the water has a reputation to maintain. Most historians agree that religion is woven into daily life in Mesopotamian cities, from household practices to temple festivals. Archaeology suggests people leave offerings, recite hymns, and mark time with ritual calendars. And again, you get a sleepy little joke in your head. Humanity invents irrigation writing and city planning, and still cannot resist leaving snacks for invisible beings. Some habits are eternal. You follow the canal until it bends, and the city opens into a broader view. In the distance, the largest temple structure rises in steps, its edges catching the faint light. There is a sense of centrality, like everything spirals around that place. You can feel the economy of it, and the emotion of it, and the politics of it. The temple is not only where people pray, it is where they coordinate, it is where they store, it is where they decide who gets what and when. The mystery thread kept gentle slips in with the water's reflection. What if the stories told in these temple spaces are also a kind of long memory meant to outlast a season or even a dynasty? Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. Documented is the canal, the temple, the tablets, the labour. Interpretation is the idea that repeated mythic motifs may guide behaviour and hierarchy. Imagined is what you are about to let your mind do softly without insisting on it. As you watch the canal, the reflection shifts. A lantern passes. The surface ripples. For a moment, a bright streak appears, then breaks apart. It could be nothing. It could be someone crossing with a torch. It could be the moon caught in a moving wave. But your bedtime brain enjoys a question that does not demand an answer. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the repeated language about powerful beings who come and go is not predicting a literal event, but reminding people that the world has cycles, and that authority can return in new forms? A fringe idea proposes that ancient peoples encoded warnings about visitors from the sky using myth as camouflage. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it floats through popular imagination, especially when modern ears hear words like descend, ascend, return, and judge. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, then the canal's reflection becomes a metaphor. The return might be a way of saying pay attention, because the forces that shape your life do not disappear forever. They come back as floods, as droughts, as new rulers, as old mistakes repeating. You step past a group of workers sleeping on mats near a storage yard. Their tools lie nearby, simple shapes in the dark, and you can almost smell the sweat and straw. Archaeology suggests labour is organised and sometimes recorded in rations and lists. The evidence we do have points to a city that runs on coordinated work, much of it hard, repetitive and necessary. You have a brief modern thought that you would absolutely get fired from canal duty on day one because you would spend all morning trying to convince your supervisor that you are better suited to indoor tasks like staring at clay tablets and looking thoughtful. A breeze runs over the canal and the water makes a soft sound against the bank. You let that sound become your guide like a fan humming in the corner of your room. The city feels less like a museum and more like a living system, breathing through waterways and stories at the same time. And as you keep walking, you carry one quiet idea with you. Maybe the first routines of city life are not only about moving water and counting grain. Maybe they are also about moving meaning so that people can keep doing the hard parts without falling apart. You keep moving toward the higher ground of the city's centre, and the canal sound fades behind you until it becomes more memory than noise. The streets narrow again, and the mud brick walls hold the night air like a cool jar. Somewhere above an owl calls and you feel the city's silence respond like a slow blink. Ahead the ziggurat rises in stepped layers, not as a single perfect pyramid, but as a practical mountain of brick built by hands that have bills to pay in barley. Most historians agree that these temple platforms function as major religious and civic landmarks, and archaeology suggests they are built, rebuilt and expanded over time, sometimes with earlier layers hidden inside later ones, like a giant architectural nesting doll. The evidence we do have points to a world where height matters, because height lets you see farther, be seen, and feel closer to whatever you name sacred. You begin the climb and the steps feel slightly uneven under your sandals. You can smell bitumen used as mortar, in places a tar-like scent that makes you think of modern roads, which is funny and also strangely comforting. You want to laugh softly at the idea that ancient Mesopotamia had its own version of construction fumes. Humans truly do not change. We just swap the brand names. As you ascend, you notice small alcoves and side rooms, spaces where people might store offerings or tools, or where priests might keep quiet records. What's broadly accepted is that temple complexes include not only shrines but administrative areas, storage and workshops. The temple is a spiritual address, sure, but it is also a logistical organism. It takes in goods, sends out rations, manages land, and maintains prestige. If you are looking for the spine of the city, you can feel it here under your feet. At the top level, the air opens. You can see rooftops spread out like a textured sea, and beyond them the flat land, the canal lines, the dark ribbon of river in the distance. The stars are clearer up here, less blocked by walls, and you suddenly understand why the sky becomes language. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian peoples pay close attention to the heavens, tracking the movements of the sun, moon, and visible planets, and later developing sophisticated astronomy and astrology traditions. Archaeology suggests that observation of the sky helps build calendars that organize agriculture and festivals. The evidence we do have points to practical uses. Knowing when seasons shift matters, and knowing when to plant is not optional if you want to eat. And yet a careful reading might suggest something else. When you watch the sky every night, the sky becomes a storybook. It becomes a place where patterns feel like messages, because the human brain is a message-making machine. One interpretation is that priestly observation is not only about measurement, but about meaning. Omens for many ancient societies are not always panic alarms. They can be frameworks for decision-making, ways to say conditions look risky, be cautious, or the king should delay this project, or everyone should prepare offerings to restore balance. A more cautious explanation could be that omens are early risk management, dressed in sacred clothing so people take them seriously. You imagine a priest on this very platform, wrapped in a wool garment against the night chill, watching Venus brighten near the horizon. The priest speaks quietly to a scribe who records the observation not only as a celestial fact, but as a social signal. You can feel the power of it. If the heavens speak, the temple interprets. If the temple interprets, the temple guides. And if the temple guides, the city follows, or at least pretends to. Historians still argue whether omen literature should be understood primarily as religious devotion, political strategy, scientific observation, or cultural psychology. That debate matters because it keeps you from flattening complex traditions into one modern label. To be clear, this is debated. Some interpretations lean practical, some lean symbolic, and often the truth is that it can be both at once. Now, the misty part handled gently. The Anunnaki are not floating down like sci-fi characters in a spotlight. The evidence we do have points to them as divine figures in a rich, mythic landscape, and their roles vary across texts and eras. But bedtime is the perfect time for a quiet what if. What if, in the language of sky watching, the idea of beings who descend and ascend becomes more than a mythic scene? What if it becomes a metaphor for cycles of authority returning again and again, like planets looping back into view? A fringe idea proposes that ancient sky language contains coded warnings about literal visitors. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the evidence for it is thin. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. Still, the idea persists as a popular rumour because it fits a modern appetite for hidden messages and cosmic drama. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, then the ziggurat becomes an interesting stage. Not a landing pad, not a spaceship dock, but a platform for watching, remembering, and telling stories in a way that keeps a community oriented. You sit down on a cool brick ledge, letting your legs rest. Below the city is quiet, and above the sky is busy. You notice that the stars do not feel random. They feel arranged, even if you know that is your brain doing what it does. A sleepy joke arrives. Your ancestors looked at the sky and invented constellations, and you look at the sky and invent excuses to stay up late. Different eras, same hobby. A lamp glows from a small upper chamber, and you wander toward it. Inside, a few people move quietly, speaking in low tones. There is a reed basket of tablets, and on a table, a fresh slab of clay waits like a blank screen. A scribe dips the stylus in water and begins to write. The motions are smooth, practiced, almost musical. Archaeology suggests scribal training is formal and demanding. And the evidence we do have points to scribes copying texts, learning lists, proverbs and hymns. Some of those hymns praise gods, some praise kings, and some describe cosmic order. This is where the sky turns into words. One interpretation is that repeated motifs in such writing may serve as reminders the world has layers and humans are not always in control. When you live between rivers that can flood and fields that can fail, humility becomes a survival strategy. The gods in myth are often ways of naming forces larger than you, and the Anunnaki, as part of that divine vocabulary, can represent a kind of high authority, a council of powers that frames the world's structure. Now, in cinematic what-if mode, you imagine the scribe pausing. The scribe has already recorded the mundane matters of the day, rations, deliveries, tasks, and then as if the stylus has its own memory, the scribe presses a line that feels like a warning, or at least a cautionary note, not a date, not a prediction with fireworks, just a pattern. The great ones return. The great ones withdraw. The city must stay attentive. Let me rephrase that more carefully. That's a possibility, not a certainty. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm, especially when we are leaning on interpretation and imagination. Yet it is also true that people use myth to teach attention to seasons, attention to leaders, attention to the fragile systems that keep food on the table. Outside, the sky shifts as clouds drift thinly across the stars. The platform feels like a bridge between the city and the heavens, between the solid ground of brick and the mist of interpretation. You take a slow breath and let your shoulders drop. The ziggurat does not demand belief. It invites perspective. You stand again, and before you descend, you look one more time at the dark land stretching outward. You picture the canals like veins, the tablets like memory, the temple like a heartbeat, and you let one gentle question walk beside you as you go back down the steps. What if the story is pointing at something else, not aliens, not apocalypse, but the repeating return of power and the ancient reminder that humans should keep their eyes open calmly without panic, because cycles do not announce themselves with sirens. They simply arrive quietly like footsteps on brick. You descend from the ziggurat with the slow caution of someone who does not want to trip in the dark and become a cautionary tale carved into a tablet as unnamed visitor falls, dramatically ruins, sandals, embarrasses self for eternity. The steps are cool beneath your feet and the air warms slightly as you return to street level, where the city holds heat in its mud brick ribs. Down here, the night feels more human. You smell cooking fires fading into ash, and you hear the soft shuffle of someone sweeping a courtyard. A dog sighs somewhere, the kind of deep, resigned sigh that suggests it has seen every dynasty and has opinions about all of them. You keep walking until the streets widen into a space that feels official. Not because there is a sign, because there is a posture in the architecture, a sense that decisions are made here. Most historians agree that early Mesopotamian rulers use inscriptions and lists to legitimize authority, and archaeology suggests that administrative records and royal building projects are tightly linked. The evidence we do have points to kingship as both political and sacred, with rulers often presenting themselves as chosen, supported or guided by the gods. You can feel how this works. If the cosmos approves the king, then obeying the king feels like obeying order itself. In a quiet hall, lit by small lamps, you find a scribe seated beside a stack of tablets, and you realize this is not a place for poetry tonight. This is a place for lists of names, a long, careful sequence of rulers. You are standing in the mental space where the idea of the king list begins, even if the exact tablet you are imagining may not be in this room. What's broadly accepted is that king lists exist in Mesopotamian tradition, recording sequences of rulers and dynasties blending memory politics and ideology. You watch the scribe press the stylus down, making wedges that line up like tiny marching soldiers. The scribe's pace is steady, like someone laying bricks out of language. You notice that the list is not just names, it is a claim. It says this is how the world is ordered, this is who mattered, this is who belongs in the chain. One interpretation is that king lists do more than record history. They create it. They shape the narrative that later people inherit. They smooth over gaps. They elevate some rulers. They compress chaos into a clean line. A more cautious explanation could be that these lists are partly archival and partly propaganda, meant to give the feeling of continuity even when politics are messy. And politics are always messy. If you ever doubt that, just remember that modern politics can barely agree on the colour of a tie, and now imagine running an entire city with no email, no microphones, and a constant threat of canals misbehaving. Historians still argue whether the king lists should be treated as straightforward chronology, as literary tradition, as ideological tool, or as a mix of all three. To be clear, this is debated, and it matters because one of the most famous features of these lists is also one of the most tempting for mystery hunters: the unusually long reigns attributed to early kings in some versions. Most historians agree that extremely long reign lengths in early sections are not taken literally by mainstream scholarship. It's possible that such numbers are symbolic, reflecting a mythic time before ordinary human measurement, or a way of expressing greatness rather than calendar years. A careful reading might suggest that when a culture stretches time, it is not necessarily lying. It is speaking in a different register. It is saying that era was different. It felt larger. It belonged to the mist. Now the bedtime what if can step in, but politely. A fringe idea proposes that these long reigns hint at non-human rulers or visitors with lifespans beyond normal humans. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the evidence for it is thin. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. Still, the idea persists because it slots neatly into modern fascination with the Anunnaki as more than deities. It offers a neat explanation for a strange detail. If someone reigns for thousands of years, maybe they are not like us. Let me rephrase that more carefully. That's a possibility, not a certainty. And mainstream scholarship tends to interpret the long reigns as mythic or symbolic. The solid ground is this ancient people use numbers and lists in ways that can serve cultural meaning, not only strict chronology. The mist is what you choose to imagine from that. You step closer to the tablet and trace the line of names with your eyes. You notice repetition, patterns, a rhythm of rise and fall that feels almost like the tide. And in that rhythm, your mind hears the idea of return again, not a single event, a cycle. A dynasty collapses, another rises. A city gains power, loses power. A temple grows. A temple is rebuilt. The story comes back in different clothing. One interpretation is that these lists, even when ideological, preserve a cultural obsession with continuity. The city wants to believe it is part of a longer arc. People want to feel held by a narrative bigger than one bad harvest. And if you are a scribe pressing wedges into clay, you are literally manufacturing permanence. You leave the hall and step into an open courtyard where a faint breeze moves through. The stars are still visible above the roofline, and for a moment you see the world in layers: sky temple, palace, street, canal. You think about how authority flows through these layers and how stories are the pipes. What's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamian kings often claim divine favour, and inscriptions frequently describe building temples, restoring order, and defeating enemies. We are keeping this sleep-friendly so you do not linger on violence. You simply notice the pattern. Kings present themselves as caretakers of cosmic balance. If they succeed, it is because the gods smile. If they fail, it is because the gods withdraw, or because the world is out of joint. Either way, the king list and the inscriptions reinforce a worldview where power is not just political, but cosmic. Now the Anunnaki thread can return again as interpretation and imagination. The evidence we do have points to divine councils and hierarchies in Mesopotamian religion. One interpretation is that naming a council of gods mirrors the structure of human governance. If humans have councils, elders, administrators, then gods might be imagined similarly. It's possible that stories about divine assemblies teach people how to accept human assemblies, and yet in calm what-if mode, you can imagine a scribe writing a list of kings with a second thought in the back of the mind. Power is never only human. It belongs to forces that outlast any one person. The gods return in the sense that the idea of divine authority returns whenever a new king is crowned. The council returns whenever the city needs justification for why one family rules and another does not. A popular rumour claims that the Anunnaki were literal beings who once ruled and will return, and you can feel how such a rumour grows. It grows in the gaps between broken tablets. It grows in the symbolic numbers. It grows in the way the word return feels like a hook in your imagination. But the mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. You walk along the street again, and the city's quiet seems deeper as if even the bricks are listening. A sleepy joke taps your shoulder. You have now spent the evening with accountants, priests, and kings, and somehow nobody has offered you a chair. Ancient hospitality is apparently very selective. Still, you feel a calm thread weaving through it all. The king list is not just a list, it is a human attempt to tame time. And when humans try to tame time, they often create myths about what came before and what might come back. You let that thought settle as you pass a doorway where a lamp burns low. Inside, someone murmurs a prayer, not because they are afraid, but because routine is soothing. You keep walking, and the night holds you gently. Somewhere in the city, a scribe presses another wedge into clay, and the line continues, name after name, as if to say the story does not end, it returns. You walk on, and the city's official spaces thin out into neighbourhoods, again where the walls are closer and the light is softer. The air smells like smoke that has settled into brick over generations. Somewhere a baby makes a tiny sound and then goes quiet, as if even the baby knows this is a place where people whisper at night. You turn a corner and find yourself near a small courtyard shrine, the kind that does not look like power, but like comfort. A low table holds offerings. A clay lamp throws a warm circle onto the ground. Someone has placed a few flowers that look tired but sincere. Most historians agree that religion in Mesopotamia is not confined to grand temples. It spills into household practice, neighbourhood shrines, and daily gestures. Archaeology suggests that people keep small devotional objects and make offerings in domestic contexts. The evidence we do have points to a world where sacred attention is woven into routine, like tying your shoes. A woman in a simple garment sits on a mat, speaking softly to a child who leans against her shoulder. You cannot hear the exact words, but you can hear the cadence. It is the cadence of story. The child's eyes are half-lidded. The woman's voice rises and falls in a rhythm that makes the night feel safer. You stand at the edge of the courtyard like a polite ghost, and you realise you have stumbled into a bedtime story inside your bedtime story. Very meta, very ancient, very relatable. What's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamian myths include powerful narratives about God's order and transformation, and that these stories are copied and transmitted by scribes over time. One interpretation is that myths function on multiple levels at once: entertainment theology, moral instruction, social commentary. And tonight's cinematic what-if mood settles in as you listen. What if some of these stories also carry gentle warnings about cycles and returns, encoded in symbolism, so they can travel safely through time? The woman's voice shifts and you catch the name Inanna, not because she says it loudly, but because it has weight the way certain names do when generations have held them. Most historians agree that Inanna, later associated with Ishtar, is a major deity in Sumerian tradition linked to love, fertility, war, and kingship. We keep this sleep-friendly so you do not linger on harsh details. You simply notice the emotional range. This is a deity of power, desire, danger, and charisma, all braided together. In modern terms, Inanna is the original complicated protagonist. You listen as the story moves toward a descent, a journey downward, a crossing of thresholds. The language feels like a slow staircase. Archaeology suggests that myths like Inanna's descent are preserved in written form and shared across scribal culture. The evidence we do have points to a narrative that explores loss, transformation, and return. And return is the word your mind keeps holding like a smooth stone. Now, a careful reading might suggest that descent and return stories reflect seasonal cycles, agricultural rhythms, and social realities. When crops fail and return, when rains vanish and come back, when power shifts and reappears, the human mind reaches for a story shape that can hold both absence and restoration. A more cautious explanation could be that myths give a name and a face to the emotional experience of change so that people can endure it. Historians still argue whether myths like this should be read primarily as ritual drama, a psychological metaphor, as political allegory, or as sacred theology. To be clear, this is debated. But you do not need a final answer to feel the story's function. It is doing something to the listeners. It is teaching them that leaving does not always mean gone forever. It is teaching that doors can open again. Here is where the Anunnaki thread can appear without forcing itself. The evidence we do have points to the Anunnaki as divine figures associated with the broader pantheon and underworld context in later traditions, though roles shift across time and texts. One interpretation is that references to divine assemblies, underworld judges, and cosmic hierarchies reflect how ancient societies imagine order. The gods mirror the city councils, gates officials' decisions. A fringe idea proposes that underworld journeys and divine councils are coded memories of contact with non-human beings or symbolic descriptions of technology misunderstood as magic. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the evidence for it is thin. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. Still, you can see why it appeals to modern imagination. A descent could be a landing. A gate could be a threshold of some unknown kind. A council could be a meeting with visitors. It fits a cinematic mood. Let me rephrase that more carefully. That's a possibility, not a certainty. The solid ground is that ancient people use symbolic language, and myths can be profound without being literal. The mist is the idea that symbolism might also be camouflage for something else. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. The woman's voice becomes even softer, and the child's breathing deepens. The story is doing what bedtime stories do. It is building a safe container for big ideas. And you standing there feel the strange comfort of realizing that humans have always needed that. In a world of canals, taxes, and unpredictable weather, a story about descent and return is not just entertainment, it is therapy, the ancient kind with no appointment needed. You walk away quietly, leaving the courtyard to its hush. The street beyond is darker, and the moonlight sits on the walls like pale dust. You think about how scribes write these stories down, copying them across generations, shaping them into durable patterns. Archaeology suggests scribal schools preserve and transmit literary texts, and the evidence we do have points to repeated copying as a form of cultural memory. In a sleepy joke, you realise that the oldest fandom on Earth is probably someone copying the same myth for the 1000th time and thinking, yes, this part still hits. As you move through the city, you notice that every myth is also a map. Not a map of geography, but a map of meaning. One interpretation is that myths teach you how to locate yourself in a layered universe above. Is the sky below? Is the underworld between? Is the city and within? Is your own anxiety about whether tomorrow will be okay? The story offers a structure. Things go down. Things come back. Order returns. Breath returns. The world continues. And now the cinematic what if comes in like a gentle breeze, not a storm. What if the Sumerians, through stories like this, are not warning about a literal alien return, but about the return of forces that feel larger than you, the return of power, the return of scarcity, the return of rulers who claim divine backing, the return of the human tendency to forget lessons and then relearn them the hard way. A popular rumour claims the Anunnaki will return as literal beings, and you can hold that rumour lightly like a feather, without building your whole bed out of it. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, then the rumour becomes part of the broader human habit of turning uncertainty into narrative. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm, and the gaps between tablet fragments invite imagination the way darkness invites dreams. You pass another small shrine and you hear the faintest hum of a prayer. Your eyelids feel heavier now, as if the city's rhythm is syncing with your breathing. The scent of clay and smoke follows you like a blanket. Somewhere a scribe presses a wedge into fresh clay, preserving a myth about descent and return, and somewhere else a child falls asleep to the sound of that myth. And you keep walking, carrying the calm idea that maybe the most enduring warning is not a prophecy. Maybe it is a pattern. What leaves can return, and what returns does not always arrive as you expect. You keep walking until the street narrows into a lane where the air turns warmer and sweeter, like grain being toasted somewhere nearby. The smell is familiar in a way your body understands before your mind names it. Barley, yeast, wet clay, smoke that has learned how to behave. The city is quieter now, but not asleep. It is in that midnight mode where the work never fully stops, it just changes volumes. A doorway glows with lamplight, and you hear a low murmur of voices. You step closer and realise it is not a council hall or a shrine. It is a brewing space, half workshop, half gathering spot, with clay jars lined along a wall like patient rounded soldiers. Most historians agree that beer is a staple in ancient Mesopotamia, not a luxury reserved for celebrations, and archaeology suggests that rations of beer and bread show up in administrative records. The evidence we do have points to beer as calories, hydration and morale all in one clay cup. Inside, someone stirs a mash with a wooden paddle, slow and steady, like they are rowing a boat through porridge. A worker laughs softly, as if the joke is old but still works, which is honestly the highest compliment a joke can receive. You sit on a low bench, careful not to look too comfortable, because in ancient cities comfort can accidentally turn into unpaid labour. A scribe stands nearby with a tablet recording allocations. You watch the stylus press into clay, and you can almost feel the satisfaction of that crisp wedge mark. One mainstream fact holds steady here. The administrative world tracks food, labour and distribution with obsessive detail, and beer belongs to that system. You see a line of workers, each receiving a portion, each moving away with the quiet relief of someone who just got their paycheck in liquid form. A sleepy joke floats up in your mind. In your world, people brag about artisanal hops and tasting notes. Here, the tasting note is simply, yes, this will keep me alive and slightly less annoyed. You take that as wisdom. A woman hands you a small cup. The beer is cloudy, thicker than modern beer, with a faint sourness, and it tastes like liquid bread decided to try a new career. Most historians agree that ancient beer is often low in alcohol and consumed frequently. Archaeology suggests brewing happens at household and institutional scales. The evidence we do have points to multiple beer types and varied recipes, though we should be careful with modern certainty about exact methods, because not every detail is fully agreed. Still, the overall picture is broadly accepted. This is a society where beer is ordinary. You sip, and the warmth in your chest feels like the city's heartbeat syncing with your own. You hear people talk about tomorrow's tasks, about canals, about deliveries, about who owes whom. Nobody is discussing cosmic secrets in a dramatic whisper. They are discussing life. And yet stories slip into ordinary life the way yeast slips into mash. Someone begins to recite a few lines, almost like a song, and a couple of people smile, recognizing it. What's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamian culture includes hymns and praise texts that celebrate deities and daily necessities. One interpretation is that these hymns preserve practical knowledge inside poetic language. If you want people to remember a process, you can put it in rhythm. The brain is very loyal to rhythm, especially when it is tired. You listen closely, and you notice the way the words honour the act of brewing, the way the language treats it as something almost sacred. A careful reading might suggest that when a community depends on a process, it elevates it. That elevation is not only spiritual, it is instructional. It tells you this matters, so pay attention. Historians still argue whether such texts are primarily devotional, primarily educational, primarily symbolic, or some blend that changes depending on who is reading and why. Now the misty part can arrive, but softly like steam, not like a jump scare. A fringe idea proposes that certain hymns and recipes contain hidden codes, warnings tucked into mundane instructions. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the evidence for it is thin. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. Still, the human mind loves the idea that the most ordinary thing in the room might be the safest hiding place for a message meant to last. So you let yourself try on a calm what if, just for the duration of a slow sip. What if a scribe, aware that tablets can travel through time, chooses to shape a brewing hymn with layered meaning? On the surface, it is a celebration of beer. Underneath, maybe it hints at a tension that cycles, at the return of forces that people name as divine councils, not because the scribe is predicting a spaceship, because the scribe is reminding the listener that life depends on patterns and patterns return. Let me rephrase that more carefully. That's a possibility, not a certainty. A more cautious explanation could be that layered language is simply how poetry works, and people enjoy metaphor without needing it to be a coded warning. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm, especially when the record is fragmentary and interpretation is doing a lot of the lifting. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. The workers drink slowly, not in a reckless way, but in a tired way. You watch the scene and realise how intimate history can be. Not kings, not temples, just humans and their daily fuel. Archaeology suggests that food and drink distribution ties into labour systems, and the evidence we do have points to rations as part of economic life. That is the mainstream anchor, steady as a brick wall. You notice a small stamp seal on a cord around someone's neck, and you realise even here someone is accountable. Someone signs for the jars. Someone checks the counts. A sleepy joke wanders in. The world's oldest office culture includes snacks paperwork, and someone who definitely thinks they deserve a promotion. A man leans towards you and tells an odd little rumour, the kind people tell when the lamp is low and the day is done. He says there are stories that certain brewers know special ways to calm the gods, that a particular batch made at a particular time keeps trouble away. A popular rumour claims that timing and ritual can influence fate, and in a culture that watches skies and seasons, you can understand why that rumour lives. This does not need to be paranormal. It can simply be the human urge to control what is uncontrollable. One interpretation is that ritual around brewing is a way to manage anxiety. You cannot guarantee the flood will behave. You cannot guarantee the harvest. But you can stir the mash. You can sing the hymn. You can do the steps correctly. And doing the steps correctly can feel like a small island of control. You take another sip and listen to the city outside. The sound is faint now, but you can still sense it like a fan humming in the corner of a modern room. A door creaks, a dog shifts, somewhere someone coughs once and then settles. The city is a living thing made of many small routines. And here, tucked into this warm room, the Anunnaki thread can appear as a gentle shadow of interpretation, not a declaration. The evidence we do have points to the Anunnaki as divine figures within a broader pantheon that evolves over time. One interpretation is that naming a council of gods mirrors the way humans organize authority, and that daily offerings and hymns help people feel aligned with that order. It's possible that the idea of return in this context is less a literal promise and more a reminder that power comes back around, that what seems distant can become close again. A third sleepy joke arrives soft and kind. If divine councils are real, you hope they meet during reasonable hours because you are already tired and you're not attending a cosmic meeting without at least a chair and a snack. You set your cup down. The clay is warm from the room and it holds heat the way stories hold memory. You look at the tablet the scribe is finishing and feel that familiar awe again. These are not just marks. They are choices. They are the shape of a society's attention. So you leave the brewing space with the taste of barley still on your tongue and the calm understanding that history is not only battles and monuments, it is also a line of tired people receiving bread and beer, and a song that keeps a process alive across generations. And in the soft mist beyond the solid facts, you allow one quiet possibility to follow you into the night, that the safest warnings are sometimes the ones hidden inside everyday comforts, because that is where people actually listen. You step back into the night and the air feels cooler on your face after the warm brewery room. The street is quiet enough that your footsteps sound louder than they should, so you slow down, letting the city set the pace. Above the rooftops, the sky looks sharper now, the stars like pinpricks in dark cloth. You notice that when the human world goes quiet, the sky feels louder, as if the universe has been waiting politely for you to stop talking. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian peoples pay careful attention to celestial cycles, especially for calendars that guide agriculture and festivals. Archaeology suggests that records and traditions of observation develop over time into complex systems of omen interpretation. The evidence we do have points to practical anchoring. You watch the sky to manage the year, because planting late is not a cute personality trait. It is a famine hobby. You walk toward an open area near the edge of a temple precinct, where the buildings pull back and leave more view of the horizon. A small group stands there quietly. They are not stargazing for romance. They are watching with purpose. A man holds a tablet and a stylus, and a younger apprentice stands beside him with a lamp held low so the light does not ruin the view. You catch the scene and feel an odd modern kinship. This is basically an ancient version of someone doing night shift monitoring, except instead of a security camera feed, it is Jupiter. You stand at a respectful distance, listening. The observer murmurs a description: brightness, position, timing. The apprentice repeats it back. The scribe presses wedges into clay. What's broadly accepted is that this kind of observation and recording becomes a foundation for later astronomical traditions. But even at this early stage in your journey, you can feel the principle: regularity matters. One interpretation is that omen language is a cultural technology for decision making. A careful reading might suggest that when people say the sky warned us, they may be expressing a cautious mindset about risk. A more cautious explanation could be that it is not the sky making decisions, but humans using the sky as a respected framework for decisions they already fear making. If you need to tell a king to delay a campaign or a building project, it helps if you can say the heavens recommend waiting, because kings do not always enjoy being told no by ordinary humans. Historians still argue whether omen practice should be understood primarily as proto-science, religious devotion, political tool, or social psychology. To be clear, this is debated, and the debate is important because it keeps you from reducing the whole tradition to one modern stereotype, like they were superstitious, end of story. It is never that simple. Humans can be both practical and symbolic at the same time, and most of us are. The observer points toward a bright object near the horizon. Maybe it is Venus, maybe it is another planet. You will not name it with certainty because your bedtime brain is not a certified sky map. But you can see the point the heavens offer repeating patterns. And repeating patterns are the language of calendars. The scribe finishes a line and pauses, letting the clay settle. You can almost hear the quiet satisfaction of recording something that will outlast the night. This is where the mystery thread can be held gently, because even mainstream history gives you a reason for it. When you record patterns, you create the possibility of prediction, not prophecy in a mystical sense, but prediction in a practical sense. When you see the same thing happen again and again, you begin to anticipate it. Now, the Anunnaki do not need to appear as literal visitors. The evidence we do have points to them as divine figures, and the sky is often part of divine imagination. One interpretation is that references to gods descending, ascending, and assembling reflect the way people connect cosmic patterns to human life. The more you watch the sky, the more the sky feels like it has intention, even if that feeling is a human projection. A fringe idea proposes that ancient sky watchers may have noticed unusual phenomena and encoded them as stories about divine returns. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the evidence for it is thin. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. Still, it is possible in principle that rare events like an unusually bright comet or strange atmospheric display could be woven into mythic language, because myth is how memory becomes portable. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, then the idea of return could be shaped by real observations that felt dramatic, then later became symbolic. Let me rephrase that more carefully. That's a possibility, not a certainty. A more cautious explanation could be that the return motif simply reflects seasonal cycles and the human sense that what disappears will come back. The sun sets and returns. The moon wanes and returns. The river rises and returns. The king dies and another returns to the throne. Pattern becomes comfort. A sleepy joke arrives as you stand under the stars. The sky is basically the oldest subscription service. Same content, recurring schedule, no customer supports, and somehow you still stare at it like it might answer your emails. You watch the observers work and you notice how calm they are. There's no panic in their voices. There is only attention. That feels important for tonight's tone. No fear-mongering, no catastrophe, just the quiet discipline of noticing. You let your eyes drift across the constellations. You think about how different it feels to see them without city lights. The stars are dense, almost crowded, and the Milky Way is a pale smear overhead, like flour dust on dark cloth. In a place like this, the sky might feel closer, more involved. And in that closeness, you can see why stories about divine councils might be natural. The sky is not just above you, it is part of your daily mental furniture. One interpretation is that ancient peoples do not sharply separate natural observation from sacred meaning the way modern categories do. A careful reading might suggest that the same mind that measures a planet's position can also ask what it means for the city, because meaning and survival are intertwined. A more cautious explanation could be that meaning is the mind's way of staying steady when life is uncertain. The apprentice shifts the lamp and yawns, trying to be discreet. You feel a kinship with that yawn because you are also on the edge of sleep. a gentle laugh forms in your chest, because you realize that even in ancient times, someone had to stay up for the night shift, and someone else probably complained about it the next day. The observer finishes the record and presses a small seal into the clay, leaving a neat impression. Archaeology suggests seals function as markers of identity and authority, and the evidence we do have points to their use in administration and documentation. Even the sky has paperwork. Of course it does. Now, in cinematic what-if mode, you imagine the scribe adding a line that is not required by measurement. It is not a prediction, it is a caution. Something like, when certain signs return, remember humility, remember order, remember the limits of human control. The line might not even mention the Anunnaki by name. It might only hint at a council of powers, at forces that come close again when cycles align. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is the observation, the recording, the calendar logic. The interpretation is that omen language might be social risk management. The imagination is that such records could carry a soft warning about return, not as cosmic invasion, but as the return of conditions that test a society. You step away from the observers and begin walking back through the streets, letting the sky stay above you like a quiet ceiling. You notice the familiar motif again, the one you can carry like a small object in your pocket, attention. The Sumerians, at least as far as the evidence we do have, shows build systems that reward attention. Attention to water, attention to grain, attention to kingship, attention to the sky. And as you walk, you let one gentle question follow you in the dark like a friendly shadow. What if the story is pointing at something else? Not a hidden truth carved in stone, but the simple idea that the world is patterned, and that when patterns return, you can either sleep through them or meet them with calm attention. You keep walking, and the stars slowly sink behind rooftops as the streets pull you back into the city's shelter. The air feels heavier here, more intimate, carrying the smell of damp earth and old smoke. You notice something strange about urban quiet in an ancient place. It is not empty. It is filled with resting bodies, stored grain, sleeping animals, and the constant background possibility that the river might decide to do something dramatic at an inconvenient time. You follow a lane that slopes gently downward, and the ground under your feet grows softer. You are moving toward the low-lying edge of the city, closer to where water has more authority. The sound of a canal returns faint but steady like a heartbeat you can hear through a wall. A reed thicket sways in the breeze, whispering with that dry papery sound. It is calming until you remember reeds grow where water comes to visit. Most historians agree that flooding is a real and recurring feature of life in Mesopotamia, especially in riverine environments where seasonal changes and storms upstream can send water levels surging. Archaeology suggests that settlements build, rebuild, and adapt to water using embankments, canal systems, and elevated platforms. The evidence we do have points to practical knowledge. People do not live here without learning how to respect the river. Near a low wall, you see a cluster of people gathered round a storyteller. The lamplight is dim and their faces are tired in that end-of-day way. The storyteller speaks in a calm voice, not trying to scare anyone, but you can tell the subject has weight. You catch a phrase about a great flood, about a world washed clean, about survival in a vessel. You do not need to hear every word to recognize the shape. Flood stories travel far and last long. What's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamian flood traditions exist in multiple forms and influence later narratives across cultures. The evidence we do have points to a blend of myth and memory, where real experiences of devastating floods may inform the emotional power of the story. Archaeology suggests that floods leave physical traces in some contexts, though linking any single layer to any single story is often complex, so you stay cautious. It's possible that flood myths reflect collective memory of multiple flooding events rather than one neat singular disaster. One interpretation is that flood stories are not only about water, they are about fragility. They are about the way civilization can feel stable until it suddenly is not. A careful reading might suggest that the flood becomes a teaching tool. Build wisely, store food, respect the river, and do not assume tomorrow will behave. A more cautious explanation could be that humans tell flood stories because we need a narrative container for trauma, a way to say this happened, we endured, we learned. Historians still argue whether the flood narratives should be read primarily as mythic theology, as memory of real regional disasters, as moral allegory, or as literary tradition shaped by many hands. To be clear, this is debated, and the debate is useful because it keeps you grounded. It reminds you that stories can be true in meaning without being literal in every detail. You listen as the storyteller describes warnings, signs, dreams, messages. You feel your mind perk up because warnings are the theme you are carrying tonight. You picture a person receiving an omen, preparing quietly, and surviving because they paid attention. Mainstream safe anchor societies in this region develop systems of observation and record keeping that help them respond to environmental risks. You've already seen canals and tablets and sky watching. Here the river becomes another classroom. Now the mist can drift in lightly. A fringe idea proposes that flood stories preserve not only memory of water, but memory of some larger disruption, sometimes imagined as a conflict among divine powers or the consequences of cosmic decisions. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the evidence for it is thin. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. Still, you can see why it appeals. A flood feels like more than weather when your whole world is mud brick and barley. It feels like the universe making a statement. The Anunnaki can be held here as part of that cosmic framing. The evidence we do have points to divine councils in Mesopotamian tradition, and one interpretation is that floods in myth reflect moments when cosmic order is renegotiated. If you imagine gods as an assembly that sets the rules, then a flood can become a reset, a dramatic way of saying the balance is being corrected. Again, this does not have to be literal. It can be narrative language for the way nature forces human systems to adapt. You follow the group as the story continues, moving toward the canal edge where the water glints faintly. The canal is not overflowing tonight. It behaves, it purrs, but you can feel its potential the way you can feel a sleeping cat might suddenly sprint at 3 in the morning for reasons nobody understands. The river has cat energy. Ancient people did not call it that, but you can. A sleepy joke slips in you, modern listener worry about your phone battery, and these people worry about the river battery deciding to explode. Different stress, same human sigh. One interpretation is that flood stories encode a practical lesson: do not trust stability, build redundancy, have a plan, store grain, keep boats, keep community ties. The flood myth becomes a kind of cultural emergency drill, repeated until everyone knows the choreography. A more cautious explanation could be that the story simply helps people endure fear by giving it a shape. Now, in cinematic what-if mode, you let your mind imagine a scribe in the aftermath of a flood, drying a tablet in the sun, pressing words into clay, with hands still trembling. The scribe does not write. Aliens did this because that would not fit the documented genre of these texts. Instead, the scribe writes about gods, about councils, about warnings. And if you are a modern listener who enjoys mystery, you might ask, what if the story is pointing at something else? What if the divine council is a metaphor for forces we do not control, and the warning is the part we are meant to keep? A popular rumour claims that ancient flood stories are evidence of hidden technologies or off-world interventions. But we are not proving anything tonight, we are following clues. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, then the rumour becomes a modern overlay on an ancient narrative that is already powerful on its own. You kneel by the canal and dip your fingers into the water. It is cold. It feels alive. You lift your hand and watch droplets fall back, each one making a tiny circle that expands and disappears. It is a perfect visual for tonight's theme cycles. Ripples, returns. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian societies adapt to environmental challenges through engineering, social organisation and record keeping. Archaeology suggests that cities rise and fall partly in response to shifting river courses, salinisation and political changes. The evidence we do have points to a world where nature and human systems constantly negotiate. And you realise something calming. A warning does not have to mean doom. It can mean preparedness. It can mean humility. It can mean staying awake to patterns without panicking about them. Flood stories at their core can be bedtime lessons about resilience. You stand again and leave the canal edge, letting the water sound fade behind you. You carry the image of ripples in your mind like a small charm. And as you walk back toward higher ground, you let one gentle thought settle into place. Maybe the Sumerian warning, if it exists at all, is not about a single terrifying return. Maybe it is about the return of conditions that test communities and the quiet reminder that attention and preparation are the difference between chaos and continuity. You keep walking until the city's tight lanes loosen into something that feels more open, like the walls have stepped back to let the world breathe. The ground under your feet changes too. Less packed neighbourhood dirt, more of a worn path that seems to remember many travellers. You smell animals before you see them, that warm, dusty scent of wool and patience. Then you round a corner and find a small caravan yard where donkeys stand, with their heads low, blinking like they are halfway asleep, which is honestly a mood you respect. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian cities are connected by trade networks that move goods and ideas across long distances. Archaeology suggests that southern Mesopotamia lacks some key raw materials like stone timber and certain metals, so people develop exchange routes to bring them in. The evidence we do have points to trade as a real engine of urban life, not just a side hobby for adventurous merchants. You look at the stacks of bundled reeds, the baskets of dried goods, the coils of rope, and you feel the practical truth. Cities are hungry. Cities always want more than their local landscape can offer. A merchant sits beside a low table with a small clay tablet, negotiating with someone who looks like a porter. The porter's hands are calloused and the merchant's eyes are sharp, and between them is the universal language of how much is it and can I get it cheaper. A scribe nearby records the exchange, and you can practically hear the quiet sigh of the scribe who knows this argument will happen again tomorrow and again the day after that. Archaeology suggests that writing is used for contracts, receipts, and trade records, and the evidence we do have points to seals and signatures marking responsibility. Even here, under a sky full of stars, paperwork is undefeated. You watch a cylinder seal roll across soft clay, leaving an intricate pattern like a tiny story printed in reverse. Most historians agree seals are used to identify individuals, households, and institutions, and archaeology suggests they become essential in administration and commerce. This is the city's way of saying this shipment is real, this agreement counts, and if something goes missing, we know which person to stare at until they return it. A sleepy joke arrives. You modern listener might forget your password once a week. These people carry their password on a string around their neck, and if they lose it, someone might assume they are trying to reinvent fraud. Low-tech security, high-stakes consequences. The caravan master calls softly, and a few workers begin loading bundles onto donkeys. You see sacks that could hold grain, jars that could hold oil, and wrapped items that are treated carefully as if they are precious. Most historians agree that long-distance trade moves materials like timber and stone, and archaeology suggests exchange networks reach toward regions with mountains and forests far from this river plain. The evidence we do have points to a world where southern cities depend on what other landscapes can provide. And if you ever want a simple lesson about interdependence, you can watch a city built on mud brick import stone it cannot make. One interpretation is that trade does more than move goods, it moves stories. A careful reading might suggest that when merchants travel, they carry language, jokes, songs and rumours the way they carry bags and jars. A more cautious explanation could be that ideas spread simply because humans talk, and travelling humans talk the most. You can feel it in the yard. People are swapping news with the same energy modern people swap updates, in a group chat only with more dust and fewer emojis. A young traveller mentions a city upriver where the temples are larger. Another mentions a market where copper is traded like treasure. Someone else talks about a storm that delayed a caravan for days. The talk is practical, but it is also myth-friendly because travel is where the unknown lives. And when the unknown lives nearby, it grows stories. Historians still argue whether certain mythic motifs spread primarily through scribal copying within elite schools, through oral storytelling among ordinary people, or through trade and migration, mixing the two. To be clear, this is debated, but you can stand here and feel why trade matters. A caravan is a moving library. A caravan is a mouth that carries words from one world to another. Now, the mist can drift in lightly because trade routes are perfect for mysteries that travel without proof. A popular rumour claims that some merchants know hidden roads, shortcuts that avoid tolls and bad weather, and maybe avoid certain officials who ask too many questions. This is not a cosmic secret. It is the timeless rumour that someone somewhere has a better route than you do. And you believe it because you have seen modern people claim there is a faster way to the airport and then get everyone stuck behind a truck for 40 minutes. A fringe idea proposes that along these routes, travellers might exchange stories of strange lights in the sky or unusual visitors, and that over time, those stories could blend with divine language, becoming tales of gods who arrive and depart. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the evidence for it is thin. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. Still, if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes an interesting way to think about how the idea of return could spread, not as a proclamation from one temple, but as a travelling whisper reshaped by every mouth that repeats it. Most historians agree that the Anunnaki in the evidence we do have belong to the religious imagination of Mesopotamia, not a shipping manifest. But one interpretation is that the way divine councils are described might echo the way humans experience authority arriving from elsewhere. A caravan arrives with goods and demands. A governor arrives with orders. A king arrives with a new rule. The city learns that power can come from outside its walls and reshape life. It is possible that some divine stories reflect that social experience in a mythic mirror. You walk through the yard and notice a pile of imported wood beams, darker than local reeds, heavier, more solid. The smell is different too, resinous like faraway forests. The evidence we do have points to imported timber being valuable in a region with limited trees. You imagine how a beam like that would feel when carried on your shoulder, and you immediately decide you will be a scribe in your next life, not a porter. Another sleepy joke arrives. Your career planning is very strategic for someone who is not actually employed here. A merchant offers you a small piece of carved stone as if to show off, and you run your thumb along its smooth surface. Stone feels like a different kind of time than clay. Clay is immediate, wet, flexible. Stone is stubborn and patient. Archaeology suggests that imported stones and metals become prestige goods and practical tools. The evidence we do have points to trade shaping both everyday life and elite display. And you can see how that might affect stories too. When new materials arrive, new possibilities arrive. new possibilities always come with new myths. One interpretation is that trade networks can be channels for shared symbols. A careful reading might suggest that certain motifs appear across regions because people borrow them, adapt them, and remix them the way humans always do. A more cautious explanation could be that humans in different places independently invent similar symbols because they face similar fears and hopes. Either way, the result is the same. A story can travel farther than the person who first told it. You sit on a low wall and watch the caravan prepare to leave. Donkeys shift ropes, tighten baskets, are checked again. The caravan master speaks in a calm voice, and everyone moves like they have done this many times. There is comfort in routine, even in departure. Now, in cinematic what-if mood, you imagine a merchant who has heard an old temple story about a divine council that returns when the sky aligns. The merchant does not treat it as a factual forecast. It is more like a proverb, a reminder to stay humble. The merchant repeats it on the road and someone else repeats it in a different city, and the phrase changes slightly each time, the way a song changes when many people sing it. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, then the idea of the Anunnaki returning could be less like a single secret and more like a travelling metaphor that grows wherever uncertainty lives. Let me rephrase that more carefully. That's a possibility, not a certainty. Most historians agree the solid ground is trade materials and written records. The interpretation is how stories and symbols move with people. The imagination is the quiet scene of a rumour hitching a ride beside sacks of grain, not as proof, but as atmosphere. The caravan finally starts moving. Hooves press into the dirt. The bundles sway. The yard empties slowly, leaving behind only the smell of animals and the faint imprint of ropes on clay. You watch them go and feel the night widen again, as if the horizon just opened a door. And as you turn back toward the city, you carry one calm lesson in your pocket like a small seal stone. Trade is movement. Movement carries memory. Memory carries stories. And sometimes a story about return does not need to be a prediction to matter. Sometimes it is simply a way of saying pay attention, because what travels away can travel back, and what comes back often arrives wearing a different name. You keep walking, and the caravan yard's open space closes behind you like a door softly clicking shut. The streets narrow again, and the city feels layered, as if every wall holds a different kind of memory. You pass a doorway where a lamp burns low, and the light spills onto the ground like warm honey. Inside, you hear the quiet, rhythmic sound of something rolling like a tiny wheel on clay. You step closer and find a craft space where a man is carving a cylinder seal. His posture is the posture of focus, shoulders slightly hunched, head tilted, breath slow. A small stone sits in his hand, and a fine tool scratches lines into it, with patience that makes you sleepy just watching. Most historians agree that cylinder seals are widely used in Mesopotamia to mark ownership, identity, and authority. Archaeology suggests they carry images that can be religious, administrative, or decorative, and the evidence we do have points to seals being deeply embedded in daily life, from trade to temple storage. The carver glances up, sees you, and nods once as if to say, "Yes. I am doing delicate work at night. Mind your business kindly." You respect it. Night is quieter. Night is when detail feels possible. He rolls a finished seal across a bit of damp clay, and the image appears crisp and tiny like a miniature theatre. You see figures, maybe gods, maybe humans, maybe a mixture, maybe animals arranged in a scene that feels purposeful. You do not claim to know exactly what each figure means, because bedtime is not the time for overconfident iconography. Still, you can feel the power of the object. A seal is a small thing that carries big authority. It is identity you can press into the world. What's broadly accepted is that many seals show ritual scenes, banquets, processions, and divine imagery reflecting the cultural vocabulary of the time. The evidence we do have points to recurring motifs that scholars can categorize and compare, though specific interpretations can vary. One interpretation is that seals function like condensed stories, portable symbols that announce this person belongs to a certain world of meaning and power. And now the part where modern eyes sometimes wobble. Some seals and reliefs have been interpreted by popular audiences as showing strange advanced devices or otherworldly beings. A fringe idea proposes that certain images depict astronauts, rockets, or technological apparatus. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the evidence for it is thin. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. A more cautious explanation could be that modern viewers project familiar shapes onto ancient stylized art, mistaking symbolic forms for literal machines. Historians still argue whether particular ambiguous motifs represent specific deities, generic worshippers, mythic scenes, or artistic conventions that shift by region and era. To be clear, this is debated, and the debate is part of why these objects remain so fascinating. A tiny image can hold an entire argument. The carver hands you the seal for a moment. It is heavier than you expect, cool against your palm. You turn it slightly and watch the carved lines catch the lamplight. It feels like holding a key to a door you cannot see. You roll it gently on a spare piece of clay, and the scene repeats perfectly. That repeat is calming. It is like a ritual in miniature. Press, reveal, press, reveal. The world becomes predictable for a moment, which is basically the entire point of civilization. A sleepy joke arrives. In your world, people panic when they forget their login. Here, if you forget your seal, you might as well announce, "Hello, I would like to be mistaken for a stranger, please." Security by small stone, surprisingly effective. You hand the seal back and look around the workshop. Other seals lie on a shelf, some finished, some half-carved. Each one is a tiny story waiting to be pressed into clay. Archaeology suggests these objects can be made from various stones, sometimes imported, and their craftsmanship reflects both skill and status. The evidence we do have points to seal imagery being a powerful medium for communicating identity and belief. One interpretation is that seals help standardize meaning across a city. If everyone recognizes a certain scene or symbol, then a seal is not just identity, it is affiliation. It says, I belong to this temple, this household, this office, this tradition. The city becomes a network of symbols as much as a network of canals. Now the Anunnaki thread can pass through here softly. The evidence we do have points to divine figures being a common subject of seal art, and one interpretation is that depicting gods and divine councils reinforces the legitimacy of human authority. If you can press an image of divine presence onto a contract, then the contract feels backed by the cosmos. It's possible that this is the entire point, to make everyday agreements feel anchored in a bigger order. And then the calm, cinematic what if. What if some seal scenes, especially those that show a gathering, a meeting, a procession, are not only art but a kind of reminder. A reminder that power is collective, that authority is watched, that decisions are made in councils. In the human world, councils return again and again in different forms. In the mythic world, councils of gods return in the stories. The return motif appears not as a prediction, but as a structural idea. Nothing stays singular for long. Everything becomes a committee eventually. Let me rephrase that more carefully. That's a possibility, not a certainty. The solid ground is that seals are used to mark transactions and identity. The interpretation is that their imagery communicates affiliation and worldview. The imagination is that some scenes might be read by a modern bedtime mind as a gentle reminder about the return of oversight and authority. You step out of the workshop and continue down the street. The night feels still, but your mind is full of tiny images. You pass a storage building and see a guard dozing against a wall. His spear rests nearby and his face is calm, not tense. The city is guarded but not panicked. That matters. No fear-mongering tonight. Just the reality of living in a place where resources are valuable and boundaries matter. You come to an administrative doorway where tablets are stacked inside, and you notice fresh seal impressions on clay lumps that hold cords closed like ancient tamper-evident packaging. Archaeology suggests such sealings help secure containers and documents. The evidence we do have points to seals being a tool for trust in a complex society. You cannot personally watch every jar of oil, so you press a symbol and the symbol stands in for your presence. A popular rumour claims that some ancient symbols are deliberately cryptic, designed to hide secrets from outsiders. This is not a crazy idea in a general sense, because humans do hide things. But the leap from cryptic to extraterrestrial is a leap across a gap with no sturdy bridge. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, then the rumour becomes another example of how mystery grows around ambiguity. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm, and unclear imagery invites people to paint their own meanings onto it. Historians still argue whether the modern tendency to see advanced technology in ancient art says more about the ancient artists or more about us. To be clear, this is debated. And that debate is quietly soothing because it shows how careful minds resist easy answers. You pause under a patch of open sky and let your thoughts settle. The seal, the clay, the repeated press, the repeatable image, all of it feels like a metaphor for memory itself. People press a story into the world, and later people press it again and see the same scene, but with new eyes. So you keep walking with a calm understanding. If the Sumerians warned us at all, it may not be in a single obvious line. It may be in repeated images and repeated motifs pressed into daily life until they become part of how a society thinks. And if a modern viewer wants to read those motifs as a hint of Anunnaki return, that reading must remain gentle, cautious, and labelled as interpretation, because the solid ground is already fascinating without forcing the mist to become stone. You wander into a quieter quarter where the buildings look less like warehouses and more like places where people think for a living. The street is narrow, and the night air smells faintly of damp reeds and old ink, even though the ink here is really just impressions in clay. A lamp glows behind a curtain, and through a doorway you glimpse a low room lined with tablets like stacked sleeping bricks. Most historians agree that Sumerian, over time, stops being the everyday spoken language for many people in the region, while Akkadian grows in prominence, and yet Sumerian continues to be written and studied in scribal contexts. Archaeology suggests scribes copy, preserve, and teach older texts, sometimes alongside newer ones, and the evidence we do have points to a long tradition of learning that keeps a language alive, even when most mouths no longer speak it at home. It is a little like keeping Latin alive in textbooks, except here the textbooks are made of mud that can survive a fire, which is an upgrade modern paper does not love to admit. You step inside the room, careful with your feet. A young apprentice sits cross-legged, shoulders tense, repeating signs under his breath. An older scribe watches with the calm patience of someone who has seen every possible mistake and has developed the emotional range of a stone. The apprentice presses wedge marks into a tablet, then pauses, frowns, and presses again. The older scribe leans forward and points to a sign, correcting him with a quiet sound that is less a scold and more a sigh shaped into a lesson. The evidence we do have points to scribal education being structured with students learning lists, lexical texts, proverbs, and literary works. Most historians agree that scribal schools help preserve tradition, including older compositions and older forms of writing. You can feel how this works. If a society keeps training scribes, it keeps training memory. On a shelf you notice tablets that look like practice work, repeating the same signs across the surface. Another tablet looks more formal with cleaner lines and fewer corrections. You see something else too, a kind of pairing where one set of signs seems to match another, as if the tablet is teaching equivalences. Archaeology suggests bilingual or multilingual practices develop in various contexts, and the evidence we do have points to scribes working across languages, especially as political and cultural shifts reshape which language holds everyday power. A sleepy joke arrives. While you watch the apprentice struggle, you have spent hours trying to learn a new app and felt personally attacked by the settings menu. This kid is learning an entire writing system on clay by lamplight, while an adult silently judges his angles. Humbling. One interpretation is that when an older language becomes a learned language, it gains a special aura. It's possible that Sumerian, as it becomes less spoken and more studied, starts to feel like a sacred code, a language of authority, ritual, and deep tradition. A careful reading might suggest that this is not accidental. Languages carry status, and preserving an older language can be a way to preserve continuity, especially when politics shift and new rulers arrive with new speech. Historians still argue whether the long preservation of Sumerian in scribal culture is primarily a practical educational tradition, a deliberate cultural strategy to maintain prestige, or a religious impulse to keep sacred words stable across time. To be clear, this is debated. The solid ground is that texts survive and show continuity in scribal practice. The mist is why people choose continuity and what they hope it accomplishes. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The older scribe reaches for a different tablet and begins to recite a passage in a low voice. The apprentice listens, then repeats it carefully, like someone trying to carry water without spilling. The sounds are foreign to you, but the rhythm is familiar. It has the cadence of something meant to be remembered. The evidence we do have points to literary texts being copied across generations, and archaeology suggests that the act of copying itself becomes a form of preservation. In that moment, you can feel how a language can live in a room, even if it is no longer alive in the street. A more cautious explanation could be that scribal culture is simply conservative, and conservatism is useful in administration and ritual. If your job depends on precision, you do not want the words drifting every generation. You want stability. Stability is how contracts, hymns, and records keep meaning, and if a king wants legitimacy, a stable tradition is a strong tool. So the old language remains, not because it hides a secret, but because it anchors authority. Now the mystery thread can slip in without claiming certainty. A fringe idea proposes that some older phrases are preserved not only for prestige, but because they carry messages meant to survive upheaval. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the evidence for it is thin. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. Still, if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the idea has a quiet logic. When you want something to last, you put it in the most protected place, and in this world, a protected place is scribal tradition. You look at the apprentice's tablet again. It is not only language, it is discipline. It is the act of transmitting a worldview. If the Anunnaki are part of that worldview, the evidence we do have suggests they belong to religious tradition, not a confirmed report of physical visitors. But one interpretation is that the way divine councils and powerful beings are described could function as a template for thinking about authority that comes and goes, authority that returns in cycles. A popular rumour claims that ancient priestly languages are intentionally used to conceal literal truths from ordinary people. This rumour has a familiar shape because humans love the idea of secret knowledge guarded by elites. It is a convenient story. It makes mystery feel organised. But it can also be misleading if you treat it as fact. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. And we are not proving anything tonight. We're following clues. You watch the older scribe correct the apprentice again, and you notice the correction is not only about meaning, it is about form, the angle of a wedge, the spacing, the order. This is the part that makes your modern brain smile. You live in a world where fonts change every season, and people argue about whether a logo looks friendlier in rounded letters. Here, the brand identity is literally the wedge shape, and the style guide is enforced with quiet, unstoppable patience. One interpretation is that form itself can carry authority. If the old language is written in old forms, it signals continuity. It signals that the city remains connected to ancestors, to temples, to the deep story of the land. It's possible that the preservation of Sumerian is less about communication and more about belonging. The words say, "You are part of a chain." Now, in gentle imagination, you allow a calm what if to settle. What if tucked inside that chain there are phrases that repeat like a lullaby? Not a prediction, not a date, not a warning that sends you running. Just a motif, a hint, a line that says, "Powerful ones return, cycles repeat. Keep your eyes open." And because the phrase is embedded in a respected old language, it survives when newer speech shifts and fades. Let me rephrase that more carefully. That's a possibility, not a certainty. A more cautious explanation could be that repeated phrases simply reflect common mythic structures and religious language. Repetition is how poetry works. Repetition is how teaching works. Repetition is how tired minds remember. Still, it is easy to imagine a scribe choosing repetition on purpose, because a scribe understands time in a way most people do not. A scribe knows that clay can outlast kings. A second sleepy joke drifts in as you picture scribes preserving language for centuries. You can barely keep your passwords consistent for a month, and these people keep an entire literary tradition stable across generations. Your brain feels personally challenged. You step back towards the doorway and listen to the city outside. The canal sound is faint in the distance. A dog turns once and settles. Somewhere a lamp goes out. The room behind you continues its slow work of preservation, sign by sign, line by line. The older language remains not as a ghost, but as a tool. And in that calm, you carry forward a quiet thought. If the Sumerians warned anyone about anything, it might not be in a loud proclamation. It might be in the way myths endure when languages shift, in the way respected words are repeated until they become part of how people think. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. Tonight you let that balance hold, like a tablet drying slowly in the warm, patient air. You step back into the street, and the night air feels cooler again, as if the scribal room was a pocket of stored warmth. The city around you seems to breathe in slow cycles. A lamp goes out in one house, another flickers on somewhere else. A dog shifts a reed mat, rustles, and the canal sound returns in the distance like a steady hush. You keep walking without any dramatic announcement because the story is supposed to glide, and you are happy to let it glide. The street curves toward a quieter district where the buildings look older, not necessarily in reality, but in feeling. Some walls are patched, some doorways are uneven, as if repaired after storms or time. You can almost sense how often this city has been rebuilt, not in one clean moment, but in endless small acts of maintenance. Most historians agree that many Mesopotamian sites are layered with occupations stacking over time, and archaeology suggests that buildings are often repaired, remodelled and rebuilt, with old materials reused. The evidence we do have points to a simple truth. Mud brick demands constant care, and cities survive by repetition. You pass a low mound where the ground rises slightly, and you notice fragments underfoot, bits of pottery, a broken edge of brick, the kind of debris that becomes the soil of civilization. You feel a quiet awe that you are walking on a place that contains other places inside it. Layers of floors, layers of courtyards, layers of lives. And somewhere in those layers of tablets too. What's broadly accepted is that many clay tablets survive because they were baked hard by accident, often through fires that destroyed buildings but preserved the clay. The evidence we do have points to the strange bargain of archaeology disaster can preserve what routine would have dissolved. It's one of those facts that makes you pause because it is both tragic and oddly practical, like the universe doing accounting. A sleepy joke floats in your world. You back up files to the cloud. In theirs, the cloud sometimes comes in the form of smoke and fire, and it accidentally makes the archives permanent. Not recommended as a strategy, but historically effective. You walk toward what looks like the remains of a storage room, its walls partially collapsed. A few people move quietly in the area, not looters exactly, but scavengers and caretakers, the kinds of people who salvage usable materials from damaged spaces. Archaeology suggests that in ancient cities, people reuse bricks, reclaim timber, and rebuild where they can. The evidence we do have points to constant cycles of loss and repair. In the corner of the collapsed room, you see a small pile of broken tablets. Not whole, not readable, just fragments with wedge marks along their edges. The sight makes your chest feel strangely tight. You are looking at lost sentences, lost names, lost arguments, lost hymns. Most historians agree that the surviving tablet record is incomplete, and archaeology suggests that countless texts are missing due to decay, reuse, and simple chance. The evidence we do have points to a paradox. We have a lot, and yet we have so little compared to what once existed. One interpretation is that gaps in the record invite imagination. A careful reading might suggest that when humans face missing pieces, we tend to fill them. We crave continuity, we crave answers, and the more mysterious the gap, the more dramatic the story we pour into it. A more cautious explanation could be that we should resist overfilling gaps, because missing evidence is not evidence of hidden certainty, it is just missing. Historians still argue whether certain debated interpretations of Mesopotamian texts and artifacts are driven by the evidence itself or by modern cultural desires for mystery, meaning, and cosmic drama. To be clear, this is debated. You can feel the tension right here looking at broken tablets. The mind wants to fix them. The mind wants to complete the sentence. But the responsible thing is to let some silence remain. Now the mist can rise gently from that silence. A popular rumour claims that the most important tablets are the ones we have not found, that there are hidden libraries, buried chambers, secret rooms, seers, under temples holding the true story. This rumour is irresistible because it turns so absence into a treasure hunt, but it can also be misleading if treated as fact. The evidence we do have points to real archives and real tablet storage, but the idea of a single hidden vault containing the final answer belongs more to modern storytelling than to documented certainty. A fringe idea proposes that lost tablets contain direct warnings about the return of the Anunnaki, framed as literal visitors rather than divine figures. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the evidence for it is thin. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. Still, you can see the emotional logic. If something feels missing, you imagine the missing piece is the most dramatic one. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm, and missing texts are the perfect fog for big claims. Let me rephrase that more carefully. That's a possibility, not a certainty. And in many cases, scholars prefer interpretations that rely on what can actually be read and contextualized. The solid ground is that Mesopotamian religion includes divine councils and complex mythic language. The mist is the leap from mythic language to literal extraterrestrial narratives without strong evidence. You kneel by the tablet, fragments, and pick up one piece carefully. The wedge marks are clean, and you can imagine the pressure of the stylus that made them. You cannot read it, but you can feel it. Someone chose these signs. Someone thought this sentence mattered enough to press into clay. That alone is a kind of intimacy. One interpretation is that the act of writing is itself a warning against forgetting. A careful reading might suggest that scribes and administrators are obsessed with permanence, because the world around them is fragile. Floods happen, politics shift, buildings collapse, so they press memory into clay. They try to hold on to what might otherwise wash away. A more cautious explanation could be that writing is simply practical, but practicality and fear of loss are often neighbours. You stand again and walk along the edge of the ruined space. You see bricks that could be reused, and you see ash darkening a corner. You imagine a fire that once roared here, baking tablets and preserving them, while also destroying the room that held them. The image sits in your mind like a lesson. Preservation and loss are tangled. That is true for texts, and it is true for stories. A second sleepy joke appears, gentle and self-aware. You have now become emotionally attached to broken paperwork. This is what happens when you spend too much time with ancient history. You start sympathizing with receipts. As you leave the ruin behind you, notice the city feels quieter, as if you have stepped into a space where voices are lower out of respect for the missing. You keep your breathing slow. You let your shoulders drop. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. Tonight, the thin evidence is the gap itself, the absence, the brokenness. Now, in calm what-if mood, you let yourself imagine a missing line from a lost tablet, not as a claim, but as a thought experiment. A scribe writes, "The great ones return," but the scribe means something human. the return of drought after rain, the return of arrogance after humility, the return of rulers who forget the canal workers, the return of the need for cooperation. Or if you want to drift deeper into mist, the scribe could mean a divine council that returns in myth when the city faces change. Either way, the line would be doing what myths do, giving shape to the feeling that cycles come back. Historians still argue whether we should treat the recurring return motif in ancient literature as evidence of specific historical memories, as symbolic patterning, or as a universal narrative structure humans naturally produce. To be clear, this is debated. You turn onto a street that leads away from the ruins and the smell of ash fades. The canal sound grows clearer again and you feel steadier. You let the city's rhythm soothe you. You accept that you will never recover every missing sentence. And in that acceptance, the story becomes calmer because it no longer needs to solve everything. It only needs to follow clues without pretending they are conclusions. You keep walking, carrying the image of broken tablets like quiet stars in your pocket, reminders that the past is not a single story with a clean ending. It is a puzzle with missing pieces. And the mystery, the real one, isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. You keep walking and the city begins to feel less like a single place and more like a conversation between forces. Brick and water, grain and labour, sky and story, memory and loss. You pass a sleeping courtyard where a broom leans against a wall like it also decided to rest, and you notice how every object in this world seems to have a job. Even the shadows have a job. Their job is to keep everything calm. The street takes you toward an area where the ground rises slightly again, not as high as the temple platform, but enough to make you feel you are leaving the damp edge behind. In the distance, you see faint lamplight on stone fragments and partial walls, and you realise you are approaching a place where archaeologists in your world would crouch with brushes and notebooks. Here it is simply a quiet zone of old foundations, the bones of earlier buildings peeking through the newer skin of the city. Most historians agree that archaeology relies on context, careful excavation and stratigraphy, and comparative analysis to understand ancient sites. Archaeology suggests that objects and buildings make the most sense when interpreted with their layers and surroundings, not as isolated trophies. The evidence we do have points to a method measure, record, compare, and resist the urge to jump to the most dramatic interpretation. You can feel why that method matters as you look at reused bricks and patched walls. Everything here is layered. You pause beside a low wall where someone has carved a small mark. It might be a builder's sign. It might be a simple scratch. It might mean nothing. Your mind wants it to mean something because your mind is a meaning machine. One interpretation is that humans naturally project patterns onto ambiguity, especially when we want the world to be coherent. A more cautious explanation could be that many marks are simply practical, accidental, or mundane. Historians still argue whether certain highly publicized interpretations of ancient symbols and images are rooted in strong contextual evidence or in modern fascination with mystery aliens and secret histories. To be clear, this is debated, and that debate is your friend tonight. It keeps your imagination cozy without letting it run wild enough to trip over its own shoelaces. You walk along a row of broken bricks and imagine how an excavation would look. A trench, a careful grid, the slow reveal of floors and walls. You imagine an archaeologist picking up a tablet fragment and noting its exact location because location is meaning. Without context, a fragment is just a fragment. With context, it becomes part of a story that can be tested, argued, and refined. This is where modern projections enter, because you, living in a sci-fi saturated world, carry a library of images in your head: spaceships, lasers, glowing portals, and dramatic soundtracks. Ancient art, especially when stylized, can accidentally resemble modern ideas. A careful reading might suggest that the more you expect to find, the more you will see it, even if it is not really there. A more cautious explanation could be that your brain is doing what it evolved to do: detect patterns fast, even at the cost of some false positives. That habit keeps you alive in the wild. It just makes you occasionally think a cloud looks like a dragon. A sleepy joke arrives, gentle and true. Your ancestors looked at the sky and saw gods. You look at a seal carving and see a Wi-Fi router. Humanity has a unique talent for confidently misunderstanding things. Now, the Anunnaki thread has to be handled with care here, because this is where modern internet culture tends to sprint past the evidence. The evidence we do have points to the Anunnaki as deities in Mesopotamian tradition, part of a mythic vocabulary that changes across time and regions. Most historians agree that reading them as literal extraterrestrials is not mainstream scholarship. One interpretation is that modern alien narratives use ancient names and images as a canvas for contemporary hopes and fears. It's possible that the Anunnaki have become a mirror in pop culture, reflecting modern anxieties about power surveillance and the feeling that big forces run the world beyond our control. A fringe idea proposes that ancient myths are disguised records of contact with advanced beings, and that archaeology has overlooked or suppressed this. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the evidence for it is thin. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. And also, to be extra clear, claims of suppression are hard to evaluate without strong documentation, and they can easily become a way to avoid the more boring, more plausible explanations that archaeology actually offers. Let me rephrase that more carefully. That's a possibility, not a certainty, and it is not the only possibility. A more cautious explanation could be that ancient myths are powerful human creations, shaped by environment, politics, and psychology, and that modern people reinterpret them through the lens of our own era. You keep walking and notice a small group of temple workers repairing a wall. They move quietly, stacking bricks, smoothing mortar. There is nothing cosmic about it. There is only maintenance. And yet maintenance is civilization. Most historians agree that much of ancient life is repetitive work, and archaeology suggests that the survival of cities depends on continuous upkeep. The evidence we do have points to a world where grand stories rest on small hands. One interpretation is that the biggest misunderstanding modern audiences make is to focus only on the dramatic parts of ancient narratives and ignore the ordinary. But the ordinary is the foundation. A careful reading might suggest that even myths are grounded in everyday concerns: food, water, social order, status, survival. A more cautious explanation could be that the cosmic language is a way of making ordinary concerns feel meaningful enough to endure hardship. You pass a temple courtyard where a small brazier glows, and the smoke rises straight up, steady, as if the night itself is holding its breath. You think about how ancient people might look at that smoke and see an omen, while you look at it and think someone needs better ventilation. Both perspectives are human. Historians still argue whether it is appropriate to apply modern categories like science, religion, and politics too sharply to ancient cultures, because those categories often overlap in practice. To be clear, this is debated, and it matters because when you label something too quickly, you stop listening to its complexity. Now, in calm, cinematic what-if mode, you allow yourself a thought experiment that stays monetization safe. What if the Sumerians did warn us, but not about aliens in the literal sense? What if the warning is about how humans respond to power and mystery? What if the Anunnaki in the mythic imagination stand for the feeling that some forces are too big to negotiate with, and that societies must build systems to cope with that feeling? Writing, rituals, calendars, laws, and communal work. The return in this frame is the return of that feeling whenever life becomes unstable. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We're not proving anything tonight, we're following clues. The documented clues are the cities, the tablets, the temples, the irrigation, the trade. The interpreted clues are the ways myths might reflect social structure and environmental anxiety. The imagined clues are the cinematic moments you let your mind create softly for atmosphere. A second sleepy joke wanders in as you consider the modern internet's favourite habit, turning every ancient symbol into a spaceship. You imagine an ancient scribe watching you do that and saying, "No friend, that is a stylized mountain, please go drink some water and lie down." You smile and keep walking because the night is gentle and your body is tired in a pleasant way. You feel the city's rhythm again, the canal hush, the brick warmth, the distant temple silhouette, the sky above. And you carry a calmer, more grounded version of the mystery with you, that the most interesting question is not whether the Anunnaki were literal visitors, but why. The idea of returning powers keeps resurfacing in human imagination across time, across languages, across ruins. You keep walking, and the city sounds thin to almost nothing. The night feels like it has settled into its deepest layer, the hour when even the dogs seem too tired to have opinions. Your own breath becomes the loudest thing you can hear, slow in and slow out like a tide that knows exactly where it is going. The canal hush is still there, but distant, softened like a fan in another room. You drift toward a quieter stretch of street where the walls are higher, the doorways fewer, and the lamps spaced farther apart. It feels like the city is giving you space to think, which is generous because cities are not known for their emotional support services. Still, this one has been teaching you all night without shouting. Water teaches, clay teaches, sky teaches, Now the teaching turns inward. Most historians agree that the Anunnaki in the evidence we do have are divine figures within Mesopotamian tradition, and archaeology suggests that understanding ancient religion requires context-careful translation and comparison across texts and time. The evidence we do have points to complexity, not a single clean narrative. That is the solid ground. It is already enough to make your mind feel full. One interpretation is that the modern obsession with the Anunnaki as extraterrestrials tells you something about the modern world. It's possible that when people feel powerless, they gravitate towards stories where power is literally not human, because that makes the feeling make sense. If the rulers are not just corrupt, they are cosmic. If the systems are not just complicated, they are designed by beings beyond your reach. It is a dramatic way to describe a very ordinary human experience. Life can feel controlled by forces you do not see. Historians still argue whether modern reinterpretations of ancient myths are best understood as misunderstanding, creative adaptation, or cultural mythology of our own time. To be clear, this is debated, and it matters because it keeps you gentle with yourself. Your imagination is not a flaw, it is a tool. It just needs supervision. You stop near a wall where someone has hung a small charm, a bundle of reeds tied with a cord. It sways slightly in the breeze. You do not know exactly what it is for, and you do not pretend to. Still, you recognize the intention. Humans like to mark thresholds. Humans like to feel protected. The evidence we do have points to ritual objects and practices being part of daily life, though specific meanings can vary, and not every object can be confidently interpreted. A careful reading might suggest that charms and rituals are ways to manage uncertainty. A more cautious explanation could be that they are simple habits woven into life, passed down because they feel comforting. Either way, they are a reminder that people here are not trying to solve the universe. They are trying to live through the year. Now, the cinematic what if can become more introspective without becoming misleading. What if the Sumerian warning, if it exists at all, is not a warning about a spaceship landing? What if it is a warning about human forgetfulness, about the way societies repeat mistakes when prosperity makes them sleepy? The return in this frame is the return of arrogance after humility, the return of inequality after reform, the return of neglected canals after a good harvest, the return of story cycles whenever people stop paying attention. Let me rephrase that more carefully. That's a possibility, not a certainty. But it is a possibility that sits comfortably on the solid ground of what you have seen tonight, a society built on attention. Attention is the recurring tool. It's possible that mythic language about divine councils is a way to dramatize the consequences of inattention. If the gods withdraw, the canals fail. If the gods return, order is restored. In modern terms, if leadership fails, systems break. If leadership reforms, systems recover. The story can be read as theology or as social metaphor, or both. You keep walking and notice how the city's physical design mirrors this lesson. The canal is maintained or it clogs. The ziggurat is repaired or it crumbles. The tablets are stored or they break. The return is everywhere in the infrastructure. Rebuild, reuse, restack, rewrite. Archaeology suggests that cities in this region are often rebuilt on their own ruins, and the evidence we do have points to continuity that literally rises out of collapse. That is not mystical, that is practical resilience. A fringe idea proposes that the return motif is actually a coded timetable, a hidden calendar marking when the Anunnaki will come back. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the evidence for it is thin. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. Still, you can understand why such a theory attracts people. A timetable feels like control. It feels like certainty. And humans, when tired, crave certainty the way you crave a cool pillow. But bedtime is not for false certainty. We are not proving anything tonight, we are following clues, and the clue here is psychological as much as historical. A more cautious explanation could be that the return motif is universal because humans live inside cycles. Day returns after night, seasons return after drought, power returns after chaos. In a farming society, cycles are not abstract, they are life. Historians still argue whether the persistence of return narratives in ancient literature is more strongly driven by environment and agriculture, by political cycles of dynasty and collapse, or by deep narrative patterns the human mind naturally produces. To be clear, this is debated. You pause beneath a patch of sky where the stars are visible again. They feel quieter now, less like a puzzle, more like a ceiling. You think about how easy it is to read the sky as message when your world depends on it. You think about how easy it is to read ancient art as technology when your world is filled with technology. Both are kinds of projection. Both are human. Now, in gentle imagination, you picture a scribe late at night, alone, with a lamp pressing wedges into clay. The scribe has copied lists all day and hymns at dusk. The city is asleep. The canal hush is distant. The scribe writes one extra line at the edge of the tablet, a personal note that might never be official. Something like, keep your eyes open because cycles return. Not a prophecy, not a threat, a reminder. That imagined line becomes tonight's safest kind of mystery. Mystery without misleading. What if the story is pointing at something else? The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. And the gentle imagination here is not a claim about aliens, it is a claim about attention. A sleepy joke arrives as you stand there under the stars. You have spent all night learning that ancient civilization runs on maintenance and paperwork, and you are starting to suspect the universe itself is also just one big maintenance schedule, except nobody sends reminders. You smile softly and keep walking because your body is heavier now, drifting towards sleep. You feel the calm rhythm of the city in your bones, brick, water, clay, sky, and you let the idea of return become something soothing rather than frightening. The return of dawn after night, the return of breath after a sigh, the return of steadiness after worry. You walk toward a quieter intersection where the street opens slightly, and you know you are nearing the end of this long glide. You carry your solid ground and your mist in separate hands, and you hold both gently because the night is for gentle things. You keep walking, and without any announcement, the night begins to change texture. It is still dark, but the darkness feels thinner, like a blanket that has been used all evening and is finally losing its warmth. The air cools again near a narrow canal, and the water makes that soft, steady hush that has followed you like background sound. If you listen closely, it is almost the same as a fan on low speed, the kind that makes your thoughts slow down without you noticing. You pass a small work area where a lamp still burns. Someone is awake, not because they are anxious, but because the city runs on quiet shifts. A scribe sits with a tablet and a bowl of water and a reed stylus. The scribe presses a few last wedges, then pauses as if listening to the canal too. Most historians agree that writing and record keeping are central tools in Mesopotamian urban life, from ration lists to legal agreements to hymns and myths. Archaeology suggests that many tablets survive in fragments and in clusters, giving a real grounded view of daily systems. The evidence we do have points to a society that manages life through careful attention and careful repetition. A sleepy joke taps you on the shoulder. After spending time here, you begin to suspect that the true ruler of the city is not the king, not the temple, but the inventory list. Bow before the barley count. The scribe lifts the tablet slightly and sets it near a warm spot to dry. It is simple, but it feels like a ceremony. You watch the wet clay become firm, and you think about the way messages harden into tradition. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. We have been keeping the solid ground separate from the mist, and right now, the solid ground is this. People built canals, stored grain, watched the sky train scribes, and preserved stories. That is already a marvel, even if you never add anything extra. Still your mind, being your mind, drifts toward the Anunnaki again, but in a careful way. The evidence we do have points to the Anunnaki as divine figures within Mesopotamian tradition, not as confirmed physical visitors. One interpretation is that divine councils reflect how humans imagine order, authority, and consequence. It's possible that when people described powerful beings who come close and then withdraw, they were describing a feeling that repeats across generations, the feeling that forces bigger than you can reshape your life. Historians still argue whether the Anunnaki and related divine assemblies should be understood mainly as theology, as mythic symbolism of social structure, as political language, or as a blend that changes across time and region. To be clear, this is debated, and that debate is what keeps bedtime safe. It lets you be curious without turning curiosity into certainty. You notice a small group nearby preparing for a morning ritual. Not dramatic, not loud, just practical. A bowl is placed, a lamp is adjusted, a few quiet words are spoken. What's broadly accepted is that ritual and routine are intertwined in many ancient societies, and in Mesopotamia, religious life touches everything from temples to households. Archaeology suggests that offerings and devotional practices are part of everyday rhythm. The evidence we do have points to humans doing what humans always do, trying to feel aligned with the world. A second light joke slips in soft and sleepy. You realise you have been wandering for hours, and nobody has offered you a formal tour or a snack, or even a tiny badge that says, "I visited ancient Mesopotamia, and all I got was this existential calm." A careful reading might suggest that the idea of a warning is not always a siren. Sometimes it is a pattern repeated until it becomes instinct. Pay attention to water. Pay attention to grain. Pay attention to the sky. Pay attention to leadership. Pay attention to the way comfort can make you forget maintenance. That, in a grounded sense, might be the most realistic warning any ancient society could leave behind. Now, the mistiest part held gently, a fringe idea proposes that ancient texts contain veiled literal warnings about the return of non-human beings, with myth acting as camouflage. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the evidence for it is thin. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. Still, if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes a calm thought experiment rather than a claim. What if some stories are pointing at something else, not because they prove a hidden truth, but because they preserve a mood of vigilance? You walk past a small table where someone is examining an animal liver with careful seriousness. It is strange and fascinating in the way ancient life often is. Most historians agree that divination practices exist in Mesopotamia, including reading signs in natural phenomena, and in some traditions interpreting organs as omens. Archaeology suggests that omen systems can be extensive and methodical, even if modern people raise an eyebrow at the method. The evidence we do have points to a culture that tries to turn uncertainty into readable signals. A popular rumour claims that some omen readers could predict anything at all, like the ancient version of a person who says they can read your entire personality from your coffee order. This rumour is not solid evidence, but it is very human. People want guidance. People love confidence even when confidence is doing most of the work. Let me rephrase that more carefully. That's a possibility, not a certainty. A more cautious explanation could be that omen systems are structured ways to think through risk, especially in a world where weather, politics and disease can change quickly. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm, and that is true both for ancient stories and for ancient predictions. You keep walking until the sky at the horizon begins to lighten barely, like someone turned the dimmer up by one notch. The city is still mostly asleep, but you can feel the shift. A bird calls once, then stops, like it is testing whether morning is allowed to start yet. You pass a canal gate and see the water moving steadily obedient for now. You imagine a scribe pressing one last wedge into clay, not to warn of doom, but to remind future eyes to keep their attention sharp. Now the pacing slows, and you let it. You let your steps become smaller. You let your shoulders drop. You let the night's images settle into your mind the way dust settles onto a warm brick. You can almost feel the texture of clay under your fingertips, cool at first, then drying into firmness. You can almost hear the soft scratch of a stylus. You can almost smell barley and smoke and damp reeds, all mixed into a scent that is strangely comforting, like history itself has a heartbeat. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is that people lived here, worked here, wrote here, and watched the sky with care. The interpreted part is that their myths and rituals might reflect social order, environmental cycles, and the constant human need to make meaning. The imagined part is the quiet. What if the idea that a warning could be hidden in repetition, not as a threat, but as guidance? You do not have to decide which layer you love most. You simply let them rest together without fighting the way blankets layer over you when you sleep. The city grows paler as dawn approaches. The rooftops shift from black to soft grey. The canal becomes a ribbon of silver. You breathe in slow and you breathe out slower, and it feels like the whole place is breathing with you. No panic, no urgency, just cycles doing what cycles do: night returning into morning, silence returning into sound, your thoughts returning into calm. If there is a warning worth keeping, it is gentle. It says, pay attention, because the world repeats itself. It says, keep the solid ground separate from the mist. It says, do not confuse a possibility with a certainty. And it also says, in the simplest way, you are safe to rest. So you let the canal hush become your fan hum again. You let the last lamp in the distance flicker and fade. You let the imagined scribe set the tablet aside, and you let the clay cool, and you let your own mind cool with it. Quiet and steady, as if your thoughts are drying into a smooth, restful surface.